In today's lesson, we're going to talk about finding your focal point or center of interest in your painting, which helps us decide what we can eliminate, how we can zoom in, what shape the canvas is going to be. And we want to do that by determining, or we want to show the focal point with the most contrast, strongest color, and pushing and pulling lines in the composition to direct the viewer's eye. Today we're going to be talking about finding a focal point or a center of interest and developing your painting around it. And the first thing we want to do is decide what it is that draws us to the reference or the area we want to paint or photograph. And in this one, again, the photographs I usually take a pretty wide, broad view so that I can take it back to the studio and crop where I want to. Or sometimes I crop there, but then I kind of lose the opportunity to maybe change my mind on what the focal point is. So I do the cropping in the studio, in Photoshop or with thumbnail drawings. And here, the obvious is right here, the rose bushes and the white adobe building and the dark window. Could be the gate here, could be the pile of wood, could even be this stuff here. But those kind of defeat, I think, what really drew me to the focal point, which is more the rose bushes. So first thing I want to do after deciding where the focal point is then eliminate what I don't think is necessary, which allows the focal point to be bigger and become more of the focus even. So I can eliminate a lot on both sides and the top and the bottom. And I will do this quite a few different times, trying to kind of exhaust the possibilities sometimes. But sometimes it's very obvious. So I can pull back a little bit more if I want to, show more of the tree on the right. But if the rose bush and the building and the window there is my focal point, I need to just get over being attached to other, could be another painting. I could move more to the right or left and focus on something else and just create a whole different painting. So this makes my focal point bigger and allows me to spend more time on what I think is the most important. And it's not always just an object. It can be an area, not just one object. One thing I might consider doing is open that gate up so that the sidewalk here and then have the rose bush there. That way the viewer can get past this wall. This wall is a bit too horizontal, kind of cuts everything off. So I might want to get rid of that. Now, if I made the gate the focal point, I might want to add something here. I'm not sure what. And maybe crop more if the gate's the focal point. Because I can get rid of more stuff depending on what the focal point is. So think through that. Now the image I'm going to paint from is here. The focal point can be pretty much one area. It could be more in here, or it could be more in here. Some of this bush, let's do it this way, more this. And I could include even more of the water if I wanted to. But I don't necessarily want it to be this tree or that tree, but a combination of the two trees with these logs in here and then some of the water. And at some point your focal point gets bigger and bigger and it's just a whole photograph. So you want to zoom in at least on an area a little bit more, which allows me again to crop. I don't care about the photographers there. I do like the water and the trees, so a little more of a vertical composition rather than a square or a horizontal. I could make it horizontal, but I think it eliminates too much of the water and the trees, so more of a vertical would work better. So after finding the focal point again, decide what you can get rid of. And what I like here is there are several areas here. This is in Sedona, Oak Creek Canyon. I even like the figure. I like this area as a focal point. And also the fallen logs, these sunlit yellow trees back in there, not the figure. But I do like that figure. And I can move that around a little bit. I can include more of the rocks, have a focal point there. But once I decide what it is, I'll go ahead and make it the rock, logs, and the sunlit tree with the dark background. So I would eliminate quite a bit more. There's a lot here that I kind of like, but it doesn't necessarily help the focal point. Let's go with more of a square, but this being my focal point right in here. And you could always have a secondary interest, although the figure would probably draw someone's attention right away. I'm going to make my lightest light, if I were to paint this, my lightest light here, darkest dark behind it in there, and darks down in here. So I would force the viewer to look here first.
and then the figure would be a secondary. So I'd knock down the darks a little bit here, make sure my darkest dark is here, my lightest light is there. Now I might have some of my hair lighter here, but it won't be next to the darkest dark. So my strongest contrast would still be here. So I can have maybe a lighter light somewhere, but it won't be next to a real dark dark. So that the most contrast is around the focal point. And I would make the yellow here, sunlit yellow, a little stronger than the sunlit blue. And I could change that and make the figure in the trees more the focal point. So, it just depends where you want the viewer to look first and how you're going to direct their eye. And not all paintings, I think, have a real strong focal point. There's always something that draws you there first, but it's not always the object of the painting. Sometimes it's just the sense of light. Now this is a painting by Edgar Payne, and he's got the darkest darks down in here in the foreground. And what that does is that pulls that foreground forward. But it's not the focal point. It isn't where your eye goes first. Your eye goes to the most contrast. And that's between this real light, warm white and the darker, not a real dark shadow, but darker. And what this gives you is the most contrast. Although the darkest dark is down here, the lights next to the dark aren't that light. So there's not as much contrast down here, and it doesn't draw your eye as much, but this does. It doesn't have to be always the darkest dark and lightest light. It just has to be the most contrast, coupled maybe with the strongest color. Now this is a painting also by Edgar Payne. And here, your most contrast is right here. Your strongest color is up in here. He's really zoomed in to this area, so there's not a lot competing. He got rid of a lot of stuff. So the viewer's eye will probably start here and then meander up to the strongest color and then down to this contrast here and then back again. So, and he always carefully designed things. This one is a painting by a little-known French impressionist about the time of Manet and those guys. He wasn't very popular, but I really like his work. It's Alexander Jacob, French painter. Little known, but and your eye definitely goes right here because that's where the most contrast is. His paintings were very atmospheric. So the darks were never real dark. So it was easier, I think, for him just to put in a real dark area where he wants the viewer to look. But always real nice atmosphere. Dark here, dark gets lighter here, and then lighter there, and then lightest way back there. It really has a lot of atmosphere. And it has more of a violet-orange kind of color scheme. Everything seems to have a bit of violet in it, with orange as the other color, the light color. Violet is the shadow. So more of just a two-color color scheme, although he has greens in it and reds and other colors, but the orange and violet kind of dominate everything. Creates a lot of color harmony there. But it's so easy to place that darkest dark now where he wants the viewer to be. Real nice, subtle, simple shapes, which makes it easier to look at also. And this is a painting by Arthur Streeton, late 19th century Australian painter. And it's very subtle, and you look at it, the darkest darks, maybe the strongest color is here. It's also back in here, but what pulls my eye, what creates a center of interest here is this river pulling your eye back to this dark area, and then this real light and warm area. So this is probably where the most contrast is, back in here. The river, the dark trees, the sunlit grass. There's nothing that light and warm in the foreground, and then the contrast between the dark and the light trees in the distance there. So there's a lot right in there that pulls the eye back there. The river contrast, the temperature contrast. Everything else is pretty subtle. Carefully thought through. Not careful in the sense of being picky and detailed, but the most contrast is right in that area in there. And he leads you to it with the river. Good painter to look at for composing, because everything in his paintings are kept very simple, and the design really stands out, and the strong contrast, his focal point really stands out. So when you pick a photograph, think about where the focal point's going to be and what you can eliminate, and then consider, is it going to be the most contrast, darkest dark, lightest light, or just the most contrast? It doesn't have to be the extreme of both values in one spot. Just has to be the most most contrast. And you can also think of contrast in terms of temperature, value, maybe even as well as thick and thin paint.